From Washington, D.C., I'm Allister D'Souza. This is your roundup of the week's biggest stories shaping the United States and beyond. This is Washington Watch. High-level trade talks between the US and India taking place over the weekend in Washington, D.C. Reports say the first tranche of a full trade deal is expected by September, but uncertainty remains on an interim deal before July, when Trump's reciprocal tariffs kick in. The talks come as India this week threatened retaliatory tariffs on some US goods. China and the US have agreed to pull back from their trade war for now. They've both slashed tariffs for 90 days after talks in Geneva. President Trump called it a total reset in relations with China. He also said he doesn't think tariffs in China would reach the same heights as before. US President Trump's three-day nation visit to the Middle East has been filled with opulent ceremonies and deal-making. The White House says the trip saw $600 billion in deals in Saudi Arabia, but according to the Financial Times, the actual figure is half that number.
Look, nothing's going to happen until Putin and I get together, okay? And I don't believe anything's going to happen, whether you like it or not, until he and I get together. Look.
US President Trump says he will meet Putin as soon as he can, but expect no Ukraine peace deal until then. Russian President Putin has been a no-show for talks in Turkey, this despite Ukrainian President Zelensky's plea to attend. Meanwhile, the first direct talks in 3 years between Russia and Ukrainian officials begin in Turkey. No breakthrough is expected. The Trump administration is stepping up its action against Harvard after withdrawing billions in research funding. The Ivy League university is now being investigated by the Justice Department. Reports say the probe will examine if Harvard has been complying with a landmark Supreme Court ruling that said race can no longer be a factor in granting admissions. Our top story, high-level trade talks between India and the US. Indian Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal is in Washington, D.C. May 17th to the 20th. At the heart of the discussions, those punishing tariffs on Indian goods imported into the US. The talks over the weekend come amid claims by Trump that India offered to drop all tariffs on US goods imported into India. That's a claim New Delhi was quick to dismiss.
And they've offered us a deal where basically they're willing to literally charge us no tariff. So we go from the highest tariff, you couldn't do business in India, we're not even a top 30 in India because the tariff is so high, to a point where they have actually told us, I assume you too, Scott, you were working on that also, that there will be no tariff.
Between India and US, trade talks have been going on, negotiations have been going on. In fact, we have, I think a team is just going at this point. These are very complicated negotiations. They are very intricate. Nothing is decided till everything is. But any trade deal has to be mutually beneficial. Any trade deal has to work for both the countries.
So what will India's approach be going into these talks? Will India change tack in the latest round of negotiations? Rishabh Bhatnagar from NDTV Profit has this report.
Right, what we're hearing with respect to Piyush Goyal's visit to Washington is the fact that he'll be there from May 17 to May 20. He's expected to meet two very important figures of the Trump administration. Number one being the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, and number two being the U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Very importantly, this is the third round of talks, in-person talks, that is set to happen between India and the U.S. In March, we had talks take place in Delhi, where a team from the US came in to Delhi. And just last month in April, we had India's chief negotiator Rajesh Agarwal go out to the US, to Washington for negotiations. So this is the third round where the two countries will now build upon the sort of talks that they've had so far over the past couple of months in person. At least very important context of these talks is also the fact that US-China relationships have somewhat eased. There is both the countries have cut the reciprocal tariffs that they imposed on each other. What we're also seeing is the fact that India has chosen to retaliate at the World Trade Organization. That is also some sort of posturing that may or may not have an impact on the bilateral trade talks that are continuing between the two countries. Remember the deadline that the two countries had set for the first tranche of the bilateral trade agreement was September-October, and the 90-day tariff pause period ends in July. So so far none of my sources in the government have indicated that it's not a possibility that a trade deal or a mini trade deal could be reached by July. So lots to keep our eyes peeled on with respect to Piyush Goyal's visit to Washington.
In other news now, President Donald Trump has wrapped up his trip to the Middle East, which saw stops in Saudi Arabia, Qatar and the UAE. Disha Bakshi has more on the visit that was full of pomp and business deals.
Aerial escorts, gilded welcomes and billion-dollar deals. President Donald Trump's 4-day, 3-nation tour to the Middle East, filled with spectacular fanfare and even a royal parade of camels, successfully brought the region back on Washington's side, after fractures appeared under former President Biden. If the Gulf were having a popularity contest, it seems Donald Trump would be crowned the winner. Despite a war raging on, this trip was not about diplomacy. Instead, Trump's art of the deal was on full display. Trump, flanked by his business entourage including Elon Musk, BlackRock chief Larry Fink, OpenAI Sam Altman among others, inked deals worth billions with Saudi Arabia, Qatar and UAE on everything from defense to trade to AI. In Riyadh, the US secured investments worth $600 billion from Saudi Arabia. The details, though, remain unclear. Trump inked a $1.2 trillion deal with Qatar, including Qatar Airways' $96 billion Boeing order. Finally, in Abu Dhabi, Trump focused on AI and inked deals worth $200 billion. Diplomacy, though, was not left out of the trip entirely. After President Trump met Syria's interim president Ahmed al-Shara, the first such encounter between the two nations' leaders in 25 years. A meeting for the history books, it came after the US lifted all sanctions on Syria. The US leader also took the opportunity to target Iran, pressuring Tehran to give up its nuclear program days after officials from both countries held 4th round of talks in Oman.
But with that said, Iran can have a much brighter future, but will never allow America and its allies to be threatened with terrorism or nuclear attack. The choice is theirs to make. We really want them to be a successful country. We want them to be a wonderful, safe, great country. But they cannot have a nuclear weapon. This is an offer that will not last forever.
The optics were ideal, with Arab leaders showcasing larger-than-life grandiosity to boost ties with the White House to further their agendas at a time of global turmoil and uncertainty. Trump's massive deal-making skills, though, has left Tel Aviv worried over Washington's stilt in foreign policy. The question is, how will closer ties with the Arab world affect this once unbreakable relationship? Disha Bakshi, NDTV World.
The US Supreme Court has heard arguments on a case related to Trump's executive order, which seeks to end birthright citizenship. It's a matter that affects undocumented and legal immigrants, such as Indians here on work permits. The U.S. Constitution grants citizenship to children born in the U.S. irrespective of their parents' nationality or immigration status. Multiple lower courts in the U.S., judges there having blocked Trump's ban, but the Trump administration wants the Supreme Court to decide if those judges have the right to be able to block presidential orders across the country. Okay, now the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, or ICAP, is challenging Trump's executive order before the Supreme Court. I am joined by ICAP's legal director, that's Rupa Bhattacharya. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's a busy time for you with all the litigation in the Supreme Court, but let me ask you firstly, the Supreme Court justices are not looking directly into the merits of birthright citizenship, so to speak, but rather if a lower court ruling should be limited to each individual state and not to the whole country. Rupa, tell me, why should a single judge or a bunch of them at a lower court be allowed to have that authority nationwide?
Well, so it's a complicated question, and thank you so much for having me today. There are a number of statutes that allow for nationwide relief, so it is something that is contemplated in U.S. law, but everyone agrees that it should be done relatively rarely, so that cases can percolate in the various federal courts, and the Supreme Court, when it's ultimately presented with an issue, has the benefit of a number of judges having considered the issue and decided upon it. Our argument is that birthright citizenship is very different because it's a fundamental constitutional right, and because citizenship is so foundational to our country and to our union. It would be completely chaotic and really untenable to have babies be born as citizens in one state, but not in another state, even as a preliminary matter while this case is being litigated. So in this circumstance, we do think that this is one of the rare cases where a nationwide injunction makes a lot of sense.
Rupa, what was the sense you got from the Supreme Court judges when they spoke on perhaps where they stand? What sense did you get on where they stand as far as birthright citizenship, the very core of the issue, goes?
So some of the justices didn't say anything on that topic. Those who, because it's not the issue before the court at this stage, those who did speak on the topic seemed pretty clear that they thought that the order was unconstitutional because it is birthright citizenship is a constitutional guarantee, but it's not, at least as the case is currently presented to the court, it's not likely that they will make a definitive ruling on that question at this stage, although they may, as we say, take a peek at the merits in order to determine whether or not an injunction is appropriate.
Rupa, remind us what would happen if birthright citizenship is taken away. How would it impact, say, an Indian couple working in the US on an H-1B visa and decides to have a baby?
So the executive order redefines birthright citizenship from what it has been for over 100 years in this country to exclude babies whose parents are either in the U.S. illegally or in the U.S. temporarily. And so the temporary category would include anyone that is here on a work visa or a tourist visa or a student visa. And so children who are born to parents where one parent is here temporarily would not be birthright citizens unless the father is either a legal permanent resident of the United States, a green card holder, or a U.S. citizen himself. That would exclude
Rupa,
a very
very
large
quickly,
number of children.
Rupa, very quickly, running out of time here. When would we expect a ruling from the Supreme Court on the case?
It's hard to tell, but most likely not until June or the early part of July, which is when the Supreme Court term ends.
All right, thank you very much indeed for coming on Washington Watch. That's Rupa Bhattacharya there joining us here this morning. In other news now, a Republican lawmaker is introducing legislation for Trump's ban on transgender troops so it becomes permanent federal policy. The latest developments come after the Supreme Court basically decided that recently it allowed the Trump administration, at least for now, to enforce its ban that was previously blocked by a lower court. Legal challenges to the ban will continue, but for now, thousands of US transgender troops will be forced out of the military. For more, we're joined by Colonel Bree Fram, an openly transgender member of the US Space Force. Fram is also one of the highest-ranking transgender service members in the US Armed Forces. Thank you very much for joining us here on Washington Watch. Firstly, Colonel Fram, how are you feeling after everything that's happened?
Well, first, thank you for having me. I have to note that I am here speaking with you in my personal capacity, and my views are not necessarily reflective of the United States government or the Department of Defense. But I am heartbroken. I look around and I see transgender service members here in the United States who have served openly for nearly a decade, accomplishing incredible things and meeting every standard, doing exactly what this nation has asked of them, facing the loss of their careers, their livelihoods, and what they have cared so much about.
Colonel Fram, the Trump administration says having transgender troops undermines readiness of the US military. What do you have to say to that?
Well, I think you can look at our service records and our ability to perform our mission both here at home and deployed all around the world. Or the argument that says we're not deployable, while at the same time, many transgender people are deployed right now today, accomplishing their mission. So for all of these claims, there is no evidence to back that up, and we have now had multiple judges rule just that. They have pointed to our service records as Exhibit A as to why many of the arguments advanced by the administration have no merit.
Yeah, right. But Colonel Fram, the Supreme Court has allowed the ban for now. Wondering what your reaction was when that came down.
I was shocked. I truly was shocked because precedent has long said that the courts should act in a way that preserves the status quo so that no harm can be done while we go through with the litigation on a policy. And in this case, we are seeing real harm. We are seeing lives upended, careers ended, and a whole huge number of people who are facing the loss of everything. And so I was just incredibly sad as to what happened from the Supreme Court.
Now, Colonel Fram, along with other trans active duty members, you have until next month to step aside voluntarily. Wondering what you've decided.
Well, first, I want to make it clear this is not a voluntary separation. No one would be leaving if this policy didn't say you need to get out now or you may be facing adverse consequences. So the decision is really very personal and depends a lot on anyone's individual circumstance. I'm going to take as much time as possible to understand and wait for service level policy to be published before making any sort of decision that is going to affect my career, that is going to affect the lives of my family. And I would encourage any other service member to do the same, where we get as much information as possible before making whatever decision takes into account our needs and that of our families.
Now, the Supreme Court decision has given the Trump administration, of course, this big win. Litigation continues in the lower court. But are you expecting any kind of reversal in your favor in the future, or do you think that the writing is pretty much on the wall right now?
Well, we're going to let the court cases play out because while the Supreme Court let the government's policy go into effect, so far through the courts that have ruled on the merits of the case, they have shown that the government's policy simply lacks any sort of evidence to back up the claims that it's making. So while I believe there is hope that the courts could continue to rule in our favor, by the time we get to that point, the damage of this policy will have been done, and we may have lost a generation's worth of transgender service members.
Michael, from just looking broadly here, away from just the United States, do you worry that this has set the clock back for countries around the world who are considering perhaps allowing transgender troops or haven't done so yet fully? India perhaps is an example.
I think it's important to note our history here in America of inclusion, where every argument that has been levied against a group that has joined the military, whether that was African Americans, women, lesbians, or gays, were the same argument used against transgender people. And every time that group proved just how capable they were of serving, and our military emerged stronger because of it. So I believe that any nation that cuts off access to talent is deliberately limiting its capability.
Thank you very much indeed, Colonel Fram, there joining us here on Washington Watch. Next week, President Donald Trump will host a controversial dinner at his golf course near DC. Around 200 of the highest bidders who invested in Trump's meme coin have been awarded the exclusive invite. Trump's auction has raked in nearly $150 million, raising ethical concerns over Trump profiting from his presidency. In an exclusive NDTV interview, one crypto meme company in Singapore told me how much it's cost them for a seat at the table. Cherry, your company had already been investing in Trump meme coins. How much more did you have to put in?
Yeah, so in the beginning, we already watching, like we are interested about Trump token for a long time since it launched. And then we saw this event. So we think, okay, it's a really good chance we should participate in this event. So at the time we aggressively, we add around 50% more. So I couldn't say how much exactly we put in, but so far until now, based on the market price, it looks like around $20 million US. Yeah. Okay,
$20 million. Now, the bidding has closed for the dinner, but are you still going to invest in Trump's meme coin? Do you have any sort of upper limit?
We don't have the exactly budget for it, actually.
Unlimited?
Yes.
Okay, Cherry, why exactly did you decide to participate in this contest?
It was like a strategy and like a meaningful decision for us, because many people say meme is slowly going to die now. So we want to let people know actually meme culture, meme is emerging again. So I think this is a really good opportunity for us to show the power.
But even with Trump's meme coin, the value has dropped. So aren't you worried about that?
No, as I say, the goal in the beginning, we do these things not for investment. So actually the pricing or the revenue is not really affect our decisions. Yeah, we are more looking for how is the community reactions and how is the people know about meme and people reaction about meme communities.
Time for a quick wrap on some other stories that made headlines this week in the United States. President Trump says the US is getting close to securing a nuclear deal with Iran. One of the senior-most Iranian officials in Iran told NBC News Tehran would forego highly enriched uranium in exchange for lifting of sanctions. The remarks are the first public statement on Iran's willingness towards a deal. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa is set to meet US President Donald Trump next week in a bid to reset ties. This comes after Trump granted refugee status to white South Africans. The relations between both the countries has soured ever since Trump took office, making repeated claims over the discrimination faced by South Africans or white South Africans in the country. Congressman Sri Thanidar has backed off from his threat to force an impeachment vote against President Donald Trump. It comes after Democratic leaders warned the effort was destined to fail and would be nothing but a futile distraction. And in the latest episode of Keeping Up with Christie, days after US President Donald Trump claimed he's getting a luxury plane as a gift from Qatar, US Homeland Secretary Kristi Noem made a request for her own private jet. The US Coast Guard has made a last-minute change to its annual budget to secure the $50 million new plane for Noem. That's it for Washington Watch. I'm Allister D'Souza.